The music hall in the middle of town was never very quiet. Even on ordinary days, there was always some sound drifting through the building. Sometimes it was the slow practice of a student trying to learn a new melody. Sometimes it was a teacher repeating the same notes again and again, asking for perfection. And sometimes it was the soft echo of a grand piano filling the large room with music that seemed to float through the tall windows. Most people came to the hall only when they had a reason. Musicians arrived for practice. Visitors came for small performances. Parents walked in with their children who dreamed of learning music. But there was also someone who came to the hall every single day and yet almost nobody noticed. She arrived early in the morning when the streets were still quiet. While others carried music sheets and instruments, she carried a bucket, a mop, and a small cloth bag with cleaning supplies. Her job was simple. She cleaned the hall before anyone else arrived. She wiped the floors, dusted the chairs, and made sure everything looked perfect before the doors opened. Most people never looked at her twice. To them, she was simply the cleaner who quietly moved from room to room doing her work. But what they didn't know was that every time she walked past the large concert room, her steps slowed down. Inside that room stood a beautiful grand piano. It was black and polished, placed right in the center of the stage under warm yellow lights. Even when nobody was playing it, the instrument looked powerful and important, as if it carried hundreds of stories inside it. Every morning after finishing her work, she paused near the stage. She would stand there for a few seconds, looking at the piano from a distance. Sometimes the room was empty. Sometimes the doors were closed. But whenever she had a moment alone, she quietly walked closer. Her fingers would gently touch the smooth wooden edge of the piano, almost like greeting an old friend. She never stayed long, just a few seconds. Then she would quickly return to her work before someone walked in. To the outside world, she looked like a quiet worker who kept to herself. She rarely spoke unless someone asked her something. She never tried to join conversations. Most people assumed she was shy or simply uninterested. But inside, her mind was always filled with music. Long before she ever worked at the hall, music had already found a place in her life. When she was a child, her family lived in a small house near a busy street. They didn't have many things, but their home was always full of small everyday sounds. The clatter of dishes, the hum of traffic, the laughter of neighbors passing by. One day, when she was still very young, she heard something different. It was a melody coming from a nearby house. The sound was soft at first, but slowly it became clearer. Someone was playing a piano. She had never heard a real piano before. The notes moved up and down like a story being told without words. She stood outside for a long time just listening. Even after the music stopped, the feeling stayed in her mind. From that day on, she began noticing music everywhere. In the rhythm of rain hitting the roof. In the steady sound of footsteps walking down the street. In the quiet whistle of wind through the trees. But a real piano was something special. For many years, she could only listen from far away. Her family could never afford music lessons. Life was busy and money was always needed for more important things. So the dream of learning the piano stayed hidden inside her heart. Still, she never forgot that sound. Years later, when she got the cleaning job at the music hall, it felt almost unbelievable. Every day she walked through rooms filled with instruments. Violins rested in their cases. Guitars leaned against chairs. And in the largest room stood the grand piano she had always dreamed about. Of course, the piano was meant for professional musicians and students, not for someone like her. So she never told anyone about the small secret she carried inside. Instead, she listened. While wiping tables outside the practice rooms, she heard pieces of music through the walls. When the doors were slightly open, she caught short moments of melodies floating into the hallway. Over time, those sounds slowly turned into something familiar. She began remembering certain notes, certain patterns, certain movements. Late at night, after finishing work and returning home, she would sit near an old keyboard someone had once thrown away and given to her. Many of the keys didn't work properly. Some notes sounded too loud. Others were completely silent. But she didn't care. Night after night, she practiced quietly. She repeated melodies she had heard earlier in the day. Sometimes she played slowly, trying to remember how the notes moved. Other times she simply experimented, pressing keys and listening carefully. Little by little, her fingers became more confident. The music that once felt impossible slowly began to make sense. But nobody knew about this. At the music hall, she was still just the quiet cleaner. Most people walked past her without even noticing. A few students sometimes joked loudly in the hallway. They spoke about difficult pieces they were learning or performances they hoped to give one day. Their conversations were filled with confidence. Whenever she heard them, she simply smiled politely and continued her work. She never tried to explain that music meant just as much to her as it did to them. One evening, the music hall was preparing for a small public event. It wasn't a big concert, just a friendly gathering where local musicians could perform short pieces for visitors. The hall filled with chairs, decorations, and warm lights. People slowly began arriving. Families sat together, chatting quietly while waiting for the event to begin. Some musicians warmed up their instruments near the stage. Laughter and excitement filled the room. The cleaner finished arranging the last row of chairs and stepped aside. Normally she would leave once the audience arrived. But that evening something made her stay. She stood near the back of the hall, watching the stage from a distance. The performances began one by one. A young player performed a lively piece on the violin. Another musician played a calm guitar melody that made the room feel peaceful. The audience clapped warmly after every performance. Everything felt relaxed and friendly. Halfway through the evening, the host walked onto the stage again with a smile. He spoke for a moment and then said something unexpected. Since the evening was meant to celebrate music, he invited anyone from the audience who wished to try the piano to come forward and play a short melody. At first, nobody moved. People laughed softly, thinking it was just a joke. Then a few volunteers began stepping toward the stage one by one. Some played simple tunes while others experimented with the keys. The crowd enjoyed the playful moment. Near the back of the room, the cleaner watched quietly. Her heart began beating a little faster. The grand piano was right there on the stage, only a few steps away. For a moment, she told herself it was impossible. This was not her place. But the thought of playing even a few notes on that beautiful piano suddenly felt stronger than her fear. She looked around the room. Nobody was paying attention to her. Slowly, almost without thinking, she began walking forward. At first her steps were small, then a little more confident. People near the aisle noticed her moving toward the stage. Some of them looked surprised. A few whispers spread through the audience. The quiet cleaner walking toward the piano? Some people exchanged curious smiles. Others simply watched, unsure what was about to happen. But she kept walking, step by step, closer to the stage, closer to the piano she had dreamed about for so many years. And without realizing it, the entire room had begun watching her. For a moment it felt like time slowed down inside the hall. The woman who spent most of her days quietly cleaning the floors was now walking toward the stage. Her steps were careful, almost hesitant, but she didn't stop. The bright lights above the stage reflected softly on the polished piano, and the closer she came, the more clearly she could see the smooth black surface she had admired so many mornings. At first, many people in the audience didn't understand what was happening. They simply watched with curiosity. Some thought she might be going up to adjust something on the stage. After all, she worked there. Maybe the host had asked her to move a chair or clean something quickly. But when she stepped onto the stage and slowly walked toward the piano bench, the whispers began. People leaned toward each other, quietly asking questions. Is she going to play? That's the cleaner, isn't it? Maybe she's joking. A few students sitting near the front row exchanged amused looks. One of them even let out a small laugh, not loudly, but enough for the people around to hear. From the back of the room, the host also looked slightly confused. He had invited people to try the piano, but he didn't expect this. Still, the event was meant to be friendly and relaxed. Anyone was allowed to try, so he simply stepped aside and allowed the moment to continue. The woman reached the piano bench. For a second she just stood there, looking at the instrument. Up close, the grand piano looked even more beautiful than it did from far away. The keys were perfectly lined up, shining softly under the stage lights. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her. Her heart was beating faster now. For a brief moment, doubt entered her mind. Maybe she should turn around. Maybe this was a mistake. But then she remembered all the nights she had spent practicing on that old keyboard at home. She remembered how many times she had repeated the same melodies until her fingers understood them. Those quiet nights had been her only teacher. And now, standing in front of a real grand piano, she felt something stronger than fear. She slowly sat down on the bench. The sound of the bench moving lightly across the stage floor echoed through the silent hall. More whispers spread across the audience. A few people leaned forward, curious to see what would happen. Some smiled as if expecting something funny. Others simply waited. From the side of the stage, one of the musicians crossed his arms and watched with raised eyebrows. To him, this looked like an unusual moment during the event. But the woman didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were focused only on the piano keys. For a second, she didn't move. She simply sat there, taking a slow breath. The bright lights felt warm on her face. The room felt larger than ever before. She could hear the soft movements of people shifting in their chairs. Someone near the middle row whispered something that made a few others chuckle quietly. But she tried not to listen. Instead, she gently lifted her hands. Her fingers hovered just above the keys. This was the closest she had ever been to a real grand piano. The surface of the keys felt smooth and cool under the stage lights. For years she had imagined what this moment might feel like. Now it was real. Yet the room around her was filled with doubt. One voice from the audience spoke a little louder than the others. "Let's see what happens," someone said with a teasing tone. A few people laughed softly. It wasn't cruel laughter, but it carried a sense of disbelief. In their minds, the situation seemed almost impossible. How could someone who spent her days cleaning the building suddenly sit down and play the piano in front of everyone? The idea sounded strange. But the woman sitting at the piano didn't respond to any of it. Instead, she placed her hands lightly on her lap again and closed her eyes for a moment. In that quiet second, her mind drifted somewhere far away from the room. She remembered the first time she had heard piano music as a child. She remembered standing outside that house, listening to the melody through the window. Back then, the music had sounded like magic. Later in life, when she found the broken keyboard someone had given her, she had felt that same magic again. The instrument was old and imperfect, but it had given her a place to practice. A place where she could slowly understand music on her own. She remembered sitting there night after night, repeating notes quietly so she wouldn't disturb anyone. Sometimes she played slowly, learning the movement of each melody. Other times she experimented, trying to find the right sound by memory. There had been many mistakes, many wrong notes, but also small moments of success. Moments when the music sounded just right. Those memories gave her courage now. She opened her eyes again. The piano keys waited in front of her. The audience waited too. But instead of thinking about the crowd, she focused on something much simpler. The music. Her fingers slowly lifted again and moved toward the keys. The hall became very quiet. Even the people who had been whispering earlier began to watch more carefully. The woman's fingers rested lightly on the piano. But still she didn't press any keys. It was as if she was listening to something inside her mind first. From the audience, someone whispered again. "Maybe she's nervous." Another voice replied quietly, "Or maybe she doesn't know what to play." A few soft laughs followed. The host standing near the stage looked uncertain. He wondered if he should step in and gently end the moment. But before he could move, the woman finally shifted her hands slightly across the keyboard. Her posture straightened. Her fingers curved gently, the way trained musicians often place their hands before playing. This small detail caught the attention of a few people sitting close to the stage. They exchanged puzzled looks. It didn't match the image they had in their minds. The woman who cleaned the hall suddenly looked comfortable at the piano. But nobody said anything yet. Everyone simply watched. Another long second passed. Then another. And then, just as the room seemed ready to fill again with whispers and laughter, her fingers pressed down on the first key. A single soft note floated through the hall. The sound was clear and warm. It echoed gently against the tall walls before fading into silence. The audience became still again. She played another note. Then another. The melody hadn't fully begun yet, but something about those first few sounds made people pause. Even the students who had been smiling earlier stopped whispering. The woman sitting at the piano didn't look nervous anymore. Instead, she looked focused, calm. Her fingers hovered again above the keys, ready to continue. But before the real music could begin, the audience was already beginning to realize that this moment might not be as simple as they first thought. The first few notes drifted softly through the hall, almost like a quiet question. The sound was gentle, but it carried clearly across the room. People who had been whispering slowly fell silent. The notes were simple, but they were played with care. For a moment, nobody reacted. The audience was still trying to understand what was happening. The woman sitting at the piano looked calm now. Her shoulders were relaxed, and her eyes remained focused on the keys. She didn't rush. She pressed each note slowly, allowing the sound to breathe in the quiet hall. Another note followed. Then another. The melody had not fully begun yet, but there was something steady in the way her fingers moved. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't searching for the right key. She seemed to know exactly where each finger should go. A few people in the front rows began to exchange curious glances. One of the music students who had laughed earlier leaned forward slightly. The smile on his face faded as he watched her hands move across the keys. At the side of the stage, one of the musicians straightened his posture. He had expected a few random notes and then an awkward stop. But what he was hearing now didn't sound random at all. The notes slowly began to connect. A melody started forming. It began quietly, like the beginning of a calm story. The sound moved gently up and down, creating a peaceful rhythm that seemed to settle into the room. The audience remained silent. People who had been leaning back in their chairs now sat up a little straighter. The woman's fingers moved again, pressing a few higher notes that floated lightly through the air. Then her left hand joined in, adding a deeper tone underneath the melody. Now the music truly began. The simple notes slowly turned into a flowing pattern. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was beautiful in a quiet way. The hall seemed to grow still around the piano. The earlier whispers disappeared completely. The woman sitting at the piano no longer looked like someone trying something new. Instead, she looked like someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Her fingers moved with growing confidence. They traveled smoothly across the keyboard, rising and falling with the melody. Each note connected naturally to the next. In the audience, people began noticing something they hadn't expected. Her hands were moving like the hands of someone who understood the instrument. They weren't stiff or uncertain. They were relaxed, controlled, comfortable. A woman sitting near the center row quietly leaned toward her friend. "She actually knows how to play," she whispered. Her friend didn't reply. She was too focused on the music. On stage, the melody continued to grow. The woman added more movement to the piece. Her left hand played steady chords while her right hand danced lightly across the higher keys. The music started to feel fuller now, more alive, carried a feeling that was hard to describe. Something warm, something thoughtful. The musician standing near the stage slowly uncrossed his arms. He stepped a little closer, watching her hands carefully. The way she pressed the keys, the timing of the notes, the gentle control in her fingers. It all suggested something unexpected. She wasn't just someone who had touched a piano once or twice. She had practiced. A lot. In the back of the room, the host also stood quietly now, listening. At first he had thought this moment might end awkwardly. But now he realized the room was experiencing something different. The woman continued playing, completely unaware of the effect she was having on the audience. For her, the hall seemed to disappear. The people watching her no longer mattered. All she could feel was the piano under her hands, the sound of the keys, the rhythm of the melody. For years she had played quietly at home, late at night, when the world outside was asleep. There had been no audience then, no stage lights, just her and the music. Now, even with hundreds of eyes watching her, she focused on the same feeling she always had, the music itself. Her fingers began moving a little faster now. The melody started to grow stronger. It rose gently like a wave and then softened again, creating a peaceful rhythm that filled the hall. Some people in the audience closed their eyes as they listened. Others watched her hands closely, trying to understand how someone they had barely noticed before could play like this. A student sitting in the second row slowly shook his head in disbelief. "I didn't expect that," he murmured quietly. The woman sitting beside him nodded slowly. "Neither did I." On stage, the music continued flowing smoothly. The woman's hands moved with quiet confidence. She leaned slightly toward the piano as if listening carefully to every sound. At one point, her fingers paused for just a fraction of a second. Then they began again, this time introducing a slightly different part of the melody. The music became more expressive now. The soft beginning had turned into something deeper, something that carried emotion, the kind of music that made people stop thinking about everything else. The hall remained silent except for the piano. Even the smallest sounds, the movement of chairs, the shifting of feet, seemed to disappear. Everyone was listening. The woman near the center of the room who had whispered earlier now sat perfectly still. Her eyes remained fixed on the stage. It was becoming clear that this moment was no longer about curiosity. It was about surprise. Real surprise. The cleaner who quietly wiped the floors every morning was now creating music that held the entire room in silence. On stage, the woman continued playing as if she had forgotten that anyone else was there. Her hands moved gracefully across the keyboard. The melody climbed higher for a moment and then softened again, like a gentle breeze passing through the hall. Somewhere near the back of the audience, a man quietly murmured to himself, "Where did she learn to play like that?" Nobody had an answer, because the truth was nobody had ever asked. They had seen her every day. They had walked past her countless times. But they had never stopped long enough to notice anything about her life beyond the work she did. Now, watching her at the piano, they were realizing how little they actually knew. The melody continued to grow richer. The woman added more movement with her left hand, creating a deeper sound that filled the room. Her right hand responded with lighter notes that floated above it like tiny sparks of light. The music felt alive now. It had a rhythm that carried emotion and calm at the same time. And slowly, without anyone saying a word, the mood inside the hall began to change. The smiles of amusement that had appeared earlier were gone. In their place was something else. Respect, curiosity, and quiet amazement. Because the story everyone thought they understood a few minutes ago was beginning to look very different now. The melody continued to grow inside the quiet hall, and with every passing second, the atmosphere in the room slowly changed. Only a few minutes earlier, people had been whispering and smiling with curiosity. Some had expected a short, awkward moment. But now nobody was whispering anymore. The piano had filled the room with something deeper than anyone expected. The woman sitting at the piano looked completely focused. Her eyes followed the keys as her fingers moved with calm confidence. She wasn't looking at the audience. She wasn't thinking about the people who had laughed earlier. For her, the room seemed to fade away. All that existed was the piano in front of her and the music flowing through her hands. Her right hand moved across the higher keys, playing a soft melody that sounded almost like a gentle conversation. At the same time, her left hand supported the sound with deeper notes that gave the music strength and balance. The combination created a rhythm that filled the hall. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was beautiful. Each note connected naturally with the next, forming a melody that felt calm and meaningful. In the front row, a few music students sat completely still now. Earlier they had smiled and whispered among themselves, but their expressions had changed. One of them leaned slightly forward, studying the woman's hands. Her fingers were moving with control and confidence. The movements were smooth, almost effortless. This wasn't the way a beginner played. Not even close. A student sitting beside him quietly shook his head in disbelief. "I don't understand," he whispered under his breath. The person next to him didn't reply. Everyone was too focused on the music. Near the side of the stage, the musician who had crossed his arms earlier now stood closer to the piano. He watched carefully, noticing small details in her technique. The way she curved her fingers, the timing of each chord, the smooth way her hands shifted from one part of the keyboard to another. These were things musicians learned through practice. Lots of practice. The audience couldn't see every detail, but they could feel the effect of the music. The melody rose slowly, becoming slightly stronger before softening again. It felt like a gentle wave moving through the hall. Some people closed their eyes for a moment as they listened. Others sat very still, afraid that even a small movement might disturb the quiet magic in the room. On stage, the woman leaned a little closer to the piano. The music changed slightly. A new section of the melody began. It carried more emotion now, like a story slowly unfolding. The deeper notes of the left hand created a steady rhythm, while the right hand played lighter notes that danced above it. The sound echoed softly against the tall walls of the hall, and something surprising began to happen. People who had arrived at the event simply expecting a pleasant evening were now completely absorbed in the performance. Even the host standing near the side of the stage watched silently. He had organized many small events in the hall before, but he had never expected something like this. The woman everyone barely noticed before was now holding the entire room in quiet attention. Her hands moved more confidently now. The melody became richer. At one moment it sounded peaceful and calm, like a quiet walk through a quiet street at night. Then suddenly it shifted slightly, introducing a brighter sound that lifted the mood of the piece. The change was smooth and natural. Nothing about her playing felt forced. It flowed easily, as if the music had been waiting inside her for years. In the middle rows, a middle-aged man who had been leaning back in his chair earlier now sat upright. He folded his hands together and listened carefully. After a few seconds, he quietly whispered to the person beside him. "She's not just playing," he said softly. "She understands the music." The person next to him nodded slowly. That was exactly what it felt like. It wasn't just about pressing the right keys. It was about feeling the rhythm, feeling the meaning behind the notes. And the woman at the piano clearly felt every part of it. Her fingers moved quickly for a brief moment, creating a small burst of faster notes that surprised the audience. But just as quickly, the melody softened again. The change made the piece feel alive, like a conversation between calm and excitement. The musician standing near the stage noticed this too. He tilted his head slightly as he listened. Whoever had taught this woman had clearly guided her well. But at the same time, something about her playing felt different from formal training. It felt personal, natural, almost like someone who had learned through passion rather than strict lessons. The woman continued playing, her posture relaxed but focused. She leaned slightly to the left as her hands moved across the keyboard. The sound of the piano filled the hall with warmth. And slowly, another realization spread quietly through the audience. The person sitting on the stage was the same person they had walked past every day. The same person who cleaned the floors early in the morning. The same person who quietly wiped dust from chairs and tables while others practiced music around her. Yet none of them had ever imagined that she carried this kind of talent inside her. One of the younger students in the audience looked toward the stage with wide eyes. "I've seen her here before," he whispered quietly. "She cleans the practice rooms." Another student nodded slowly. "Yes, I've seen her too." For a moment, they both fell silent again as the melody continued. The music now felt deeper than before. Each note carried emotion that was difficult to explain. The woman's fingers moved with more energy now, creating a richer sound that filled every corner of the hall. The piece was no longer just calm. It was expressive, powerful in a quiet way. Somewhere near the back row, a woman quietly placed her hand over her chest. The music had touched something inside her. She didn't know the name of the piece being played. She didn't know how difficult it might be. But she knew it sounded beautiful. On stage, the performer remained completely focused. Her eyes stayed on the keys. Her breathing was calm and steady. It was clear that she had played this melody many times before. Maybe not on this grand piano. Maybe not in front of an audience. But somewhere, at some point, she had practiced it again and again until it became part of her. The final section of the piece began to approach. The melody slowly climbed higher. The notes became brighter, carrying a feeling of quiet hope. The rhythm built gently, leading toward something special. And the entire hall remained silent, waiting to hear what would happen next. Because now, nobody in the room was laughing. Nobody was whispering. Everyone was listening. And for the first time that evening, the woman sitting at the piano was no longer seen as the cleaner in the building. She was simply the musician on the stage. The melody continued to grow stronger, filling every corner of the hall. What had started as a few soft notes had now turned into something much deeper. The sound of the piano moved through the room like a quiet wave, rising and falling with emotion. The woman sitting at the piano seemed completely connected to the music now. Her hands moved more confidently across the keys, gliding from one part of the keyboard to another without hesitation. The earlier calm melody slowly began to change. It became brighter, fuller, and more powerful. The audience could feel the difference. People who had arrived simply expecting a short performance were now completely absorbed in the moment. Some leaned forward in their chairs, watching closely as her fingers moved with surprising speed and control. Near the front row, one of the music students whispered quietly to another, "This is not easy music." The other student nodded slowly without taking his eyes off the stage. Anyone who had spent time learning the piano could see that the piece required skill. The changes in rhythm, the balance between the left and right hand, and the smooth transitions between notes all showed that this performance was not something random. Came from practice. A lot of practice. But the most surprising part was the emotion behind it. Every note felt alive. The woman leaned slightly toward the piano. Her shoulders relaxed as she followed the flow of the melody. Her fingers rose and fell in perfect rhythm, pressing the keys with a gentle strength that made the music sound clear and expressive. At times the notes sounded soft and thoughtful, almost like someone remembering a distant memory. Then suddenly the melody would rise again, becoming brighter and more energetic, as if the story inside the music was moving towards something hopeful. The audience listened carefully to every moment. The hall remained completely silent except for the piano. Even the smallest sounds seemed to disappear. No chairs moved. No whispers spread through the crowd. Everyone understood that they were witnessing something special. Near the middle rows, a woman who had laughed earlier now sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her expression had changed completely. The smile of amusement was gone, replaced by quiet admiration. "I can't believe this," she whispered softly to herself. Across the room, the host stood near the edge of the stage, watching the performance with growing amazement. He had organized many small music evenings in the hall, but never had he seen the audience become this silent and focused. Usually people clapped politely after each performance. But this time no one seemed eager to interrupt the music. The piece continued to grow. The woman's right hand began moving faster across the higher keys, creating a bright sequence of notes that sparkled through the hall. Her left hand responded with deeper chords, building a steady rhythm that gave the melody strength. The combination created a rich, powerful sound. The musician standing near the stage watched closely. He noticed the way her hands shifted across the keyboard. Her movements were smooth, almost effortless. There was no sign of hesitation or uncertainty. For someone who had never formally performed on that stage, she looked completely comfortable. The musician quietly nodded to himself. This was not luck. This was talent. And somewhere along the way, she had clearly spent countless hours learning the instrument. The music reached a faster section now. The notes moved quickly, flowing like a stream of water over smooth stones. The audience watched with wide eyes as her fingers danced across the keyboard. It was hard to believe that the same person who quietly cleaned the hall every morning was capable of playing with such control and confidence. The rhythm built gradually, creating a sense of excitement in the room. A young boy sitting beside his parents leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the stage. "How is she doing that?" he whispered. His father simply shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he replied softly. "But it's beautiful." On stage, the woman seemed completely unaware of the attention surrounding her. She was no longer thinking about the audience or the earlier whispers. Her mind was focused only on the music. Each movement of her fingers felt natural. Each note carried meaning. The melody now felt like a journey. It moved through moments of calm and moments of excitement, rising and falling like waves in the ocean. At one point, the music softened again, returning briefly to a quiet section similar to the beginning. The sudden change made the audience lean closer, listening carefully to the delicate notes. The hall felt almost peaceful. Then slowly, the melody began to build once more. The deeper notes of the piano returned, creating a strong foundation beneath the brighter melody above. The sound grew richer and fuller. The woman's posture straightened slightly as her hands moved with greater energy. The final section of the piece had begun. The audience could feel it. The rhythm became more powerful, the notes more confident. The melody climbed higher and higher, filling the hall with a feeling of anticipation. People who had been sitting quietly now felt their hearts beating a little faster. They knew the music was approaching its final moment. The woman's fingers moved quickly now, yet every note remained clear and controlled. There was no rush, no chaos, only smooth, beautiful movement across the keys. The musician near the stage watched with quiet respect. He could see that the performance was not only technically impressive but also deeply emotional. This was someone playing from the heart. As the melody rose toward its peak, the audience remained completely silent. Some people held their breath. Others leaned forward in their seats, not wanting to miss even a single note. The final passage of the piece approached. The notes became brighter and more powerful, moving quickly across the keyboard before slowing again into a graceful, gentle ending. The woman's hands moved softly now, guiding the melody toward its final moment. One last sequence of notes floated through the hall. Then one final chord echoed softly against the walls. And suddenly the music stopped. For a brief moment, the entire hall remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the audience needed a second to understand that the performance had truly ended. The woman slowly lifted her hands from the piano keys. The last note faded into the quiet air. And for a heartbeat, the room stayed completely still. The final note of the piano slowly faded into the quiet air of the hall. For a moment, it felt like the entire room had stopped breathing. The sound of the last chord echoed gently against the walls and then disappeared. No one moved. No one spoke. The woman sitting at the piano kept her hands resting softly above the keys for a second, as if she was still listening to the music in her mind. Her shoulders slowly relaxed, and she carefully lifted her fingers away from the keyboard. The silence continued. It was not the uncomfortable silence that sometimes happens after an awkward moment. This silence was different. It was full of surprise, admiration, and something else that many people in the room were feeling but had not yet found words for. Several people looked at each other quietly, as if asking the same question. Did that really just happen? The woman gently lowered her hands to her lap. She sat still on the bench for a moment, looking at the piano keys one last time. The same keys she had watched from a distance for so many mornings. For her, the moment felt calm and peaceful. She had finally touched the instrument she loved, not just for a few seconds, but long enough to let the music inside her heart come out. Slowly, she stood up from the piano bench. The small movement seemed to break the silence in the room. And suddenly, the hall exploded with sound. Applause filled the air from every direction. At first it started with a few people in the front rows who began clapping with wide smiles on their faces. Then others joined them. Within seconds, the entire audience was clapping loudly. The sound echoed through the hall, strong and warm. Some people even stood up from their seats. The applause grew louder and louder. The woman looked surprised by the reaction. She had not expected such a response. Her eyes moved slowly across the room as she saw people smiling, clapping, and nodding in appreciation. The same people who had whispered earlier were now applauding with real respect. Near the front row, the group of music students who had once exchanged amused looks were now clapping enthusiastically. One of them even shook his head with a smile. "I can't believe we doubted her," he said quietly. Beside him, another student nodded. "That was amazing," he replied. Near the side of the stage, the musician who had been watching closely stepped forward slightly while applauding. His expression showed clear admiration. As someone who understood music deeply, he knew how difficult it was to create a performance that touched people this way. Across the hall, the host stepped onto the stage with a bright smile. Even he seemed moved by what had just happened. The applause continued for several long seconds before slowly softening. The woman standing near the piano looked humble and slightly shy. She gave a small nod toward the audience, unsure of what else to do. She had spent so many years practicing alone that standing in front of a crowd felt unfamiliar. The host walked toward her with a friendly expression. "That was wonderful," he said warmly. His voice carried through the microphone, and the audience responded with another wave of applause. The woman smiled politely but didn't say anything right away. The host turned to the audience again. "I think we all just experienced something unexpected tonight," he said with a light laugh. The crowd responded with quiet agreement. Many people nodded, because it was true. When the woman had first walked toward the stage, most people had no idea what was about to happen. Some had been curious. Some had even been doubtful. But now their opinions had completely changed. The host gently asked a simple question. "How long have you been playing the piano?" The woman hesitated for a moment before answering softly. "A long time," she said. Her voice was calm and modest. The audience listened carefully. "I never had lessons," she added after a short pause. Those words surprised many people even more. Some in the audience exchanged amazed glances. "No lessons?" The host looked impressed. "Then how did you learn?" he asked kindly. The woman smiled slightly, remembering the quiet nights at home. "I listened," she said. The answer was simple, but it carried a lot of meaning. She had listened to the music through walls, through open doors, and through the practice rooms she cleaned every day. She had listened carefully, remembering melodies and trying them again later on her old keyboard. She had practiced when no one was watching, when the hall was empty, when the world was quiet. The audience seemed touched by the honesty of her answer. The host nodded with admiration. "Well," he said with a smile, "all that listening clearly worked." The crowd laughed softly and clapped again. The moment felt warm and joyful, but something else had changed in the room as well. The woman who had quietly cleaned the floors was no longer invisible. People were seeing her in a completely different way now. She was not just the cleaner who walked through the hall early in the morning. She was someone who carried a deep love for music. Someone who had spent years learning in silence. Someone who had finally allowed that hidden talent to be heard. After a few more seconds of applause, the woman stepped slightly away from the piano. She looked at the instrument once more before turning toward the stage steps. As she walked down from the stage, several people nearby smiled warmly at her. A few even nodded respectfully as she passed. The music students who had watched closely earlier now looked thoughtful. One of them quietly said, "Talent can be anywhere." Another student replied, "Yes, we just don't always notice it." The woman returned to the back of the hall where she had stood earlier in the evening. But everything felt different now. The same room, the same people. Yet the atmosphere had changed completely. Instead of whispers and curious looks, there were smiles and quiet respect. And somewhere inside the hearts of many people in that hall, an important reminder had taken root. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories are hidden in the most ordinary places. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one who carries something truly special. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment and a piano to reveal a completely different story.